1887, Montana. 47 miners entered the shaft and never walked out alive again. The morning of January 24th, 1887, should have been nothing more than another cold, gray start in a Montana mining town. Snow had drifted in the night, covering rooftops and quieting the streets. Horses' hooves sank deep in the slush. Smoke curled slowly from chimneys as wives lit their stoves and children stirred beneath thick quilts. On the surface, it was an ordinary winter dawn. Yet by the time the sun rose high enough to strike the icy hills, the town would be marked forever by absence. 47 men would step below the earth that morning and never return. The mine loomed just beyond the edge of town. It was the kind of place where men vanished into darkness every day, swallowed by the shaft's black mouth, only to rise again hours later with sweat-streaked faces and coal-stained hands. For them, danger was nothing unusual. A falling beam, a misfired blast, a trickle of water whispering of collapse. These were the sounds and shadows of their lives. But on this morning, no warning bell rang, no omen split the silence. The miners kissed their wives goodbye, pulled their coats tighter against the wind, and marched together toward the shaft. The lanterns flickered as they entered, each flame a fragile promise of light in the miles of tunnels below. Boots scraped against wet stone. The wooden cage rattled as it lowered, groaning under the weight of men who trusted it with their lives. 47 descended that day. The townspeople above carried on, unaware that the earth was preparing to keep them. By mid-morning, the surface town bustled as usual. Children trudged to school, merchants opened their doors, and black smoke rose from the smelter. The miners' wives gathered near the shaft gate, as they always did, waiting for the shifts to change. They had no reason to worry, yet. Life in a mining town was lived on borrowed time, but the worst was always imagined for tomorrow, never today. Beneath the earth, the air thickened. Men swung their pickaxes against rock, the sound echoing like hammer blows inside a cathedral of stone. Dust clung to their throats, and sweat beaded under their collars despite the cold. They laughed, shouted, and cursed in the half-dark, their voices blending with the steady rhythm of work. But somewhere, deeper in the veins of the mine, the walls had begun to whisper. A crack splintered unseen. A drip grew into a trickle. Pressure, long ignored, shifted in silence. No one heard it first. No one could. By the time a faint rumble quivered through the shaft timbers, the men were too deep to retreat. Dust sifted from the beams like falling snow. A single lantern flickered, then steadied. "It's nothing," one of them likely muttered, forcing a grin, gripping his tool tighter. But in every man's chest, the same thought must have struck like ice. What if it wasn't? Above ground, the wives glanced at the horizon. They noticed nothing unusual. The town clock ticked past 11. Life was steady, safe, or so it seemed. Down below, the rumble grew louder. The ground shifted like a sleeping beast turning in its bed. Then came the groan, a sound too deep, too wide, too ancient to belong to anything but the mountain itself. And just like that, ordinary was gone. When the wooden cage shuddered and began its slow drop into the black, 47 men stood shoulder to shoulder, their breaths clouding in the lantern glow. The shaft groaned as if reluctant to release them into its belly. Chains rattled, gears shrieked, and the earth swallowed them one layer at a time. Above, the square of pale winter sky shrank, then vanished. The world of light was gone. For the men, this ritual was as ordinary as tying their boots. Every shift began with the same uneasy silence, broken only by the creak of timbers and the faint hiss of oil lamps. Some chewed tobacco. Others whispered short prayers. A few closed their eyes and gripped the cage rails, steadying themselves against the swaying descent. The cage dropped past ledges lined with dripping rock. Water streaked the walls, glistening like veins of silver in the dim light. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. Damp, cold, heavy enough that each breath felt stolen, borrowed from the earth itself. When the cage finally lurched to a stop, the men stepped out into a tunnel that smelled of dust and rusted iron. This was their kingdom and their prison. They moved in groups down branching corridors, boots echoing against stone. Some carried drills and hammers. Others bore picks and blasting powder. The lamps they held cast trembling halos against the walls, leaving shadows that seemed to move on their own. The mine was alive, always alive. Groans and cracks came from the earth at odd intervals, like the mountain speaking in a language no man could translate. One of the older miners, a man called Redby for his thick beard, spat into the dirt as he walked. He had been underground for 2 decades and carried the kind of silence that only years of risk could carve into a man. The younger ones watched him. If Redby was calm, they told themselves, then all was well. But even Redby paused that morning. He placed a hand on a timber beam, listening to something deep in the earth. His eyes narrowed, though he said nothing. A moment later, he swung his pick against the wall with the rest, dust billowing into the narrow space. The rhythm of work soon filled the tunnels. Strike, echo, crack, strike, echo, crack. The men worked like a living machine, their voices bouncing off the walls. They sang half-songs, cursed at the stubborn stone, joked about the whiskey they'd drink once the shift ended. And yet, beneath the laughter, there was the unspoken truth. Every descent could be the last. Above ground, the town carried on. But the mine had a heartbeat of its own, hidden under layers of rock. The deeper the men carved, the louder it seemed to pulse. A drip of water struck a puddle, echoing like a drumbeat. A beam groaned. Dust trickled down in a fine mist. No one stopped to question it. In a mine, everything made noise. You learned to ignore it or go mad listening. Still, some of them felt it. The way the earth seemed tighter that day, like a fist slowly closing. The air had a different weight. The walls felt closer. Their laughter rang thinner than usual. 1 or 2 glanced toward the shaft, though no one admitted why. Hours passed. Sweat dripped, hands blistered, the lamps dimmed with soot. They pressed deeper, chasing veins of or through twisting passageways. The earth seemed endless. And yet, all of them knew there was only one way out. The same rattling cage that had carried them down. When the shift bell echoed faintly from the distance, signaling midday, the men paused. They leaned on their picks, wiped their brows, and drew deep breaths of the foul air. Above them, families were preparing meals. Children laughed in the snow. The surface world seemed impossibly far away. And for these men, it already was. The town of Granite Hollow had always lived in the shadow of the mine. It was no grand city, no sprawling frontier capital, just a cluster of wooden houses clinging to the frozen Montana earth, surrounded by hills that promised wealth for those willing to dig deep enough. Smoke from chimneys curled skyward, blending with the gray clouds that seemed to hang permanently above. Every building, the saloon, the general store, the church with its leaning steeple, existed because of the mine. Without it, there would be nothing but snow and silence. The people knew this truth well. Their lives were shackled to the veins of or beneath their boots. Wives cooked meals from flour bought with mining pay. Children wore boots, patched again and again with wages pulled from the earth. Even the preacher's sermons bent toward the mine, his words painting God as a provider who buried blessings in the dark for men to uncover. But no one said aloud the darker truth, that God might also bury the men themselves. The ground beneath Granite Hollow was not steady ground. The hills were riddled with hollowed shafts, timber supports straining like old bones against the crushing weight of stone. The earth groaned at night, and sometimes cracks opened in fields without warning. The children whispered about ghosts beneath their floors, shadows of men who had gone down into the dark and never risen again. The company assured everyone it was safe. They posted numbers on chalkboards at the mine entrance. Tons of rock hauled, hours worked, accidents avoided. But safety was a fragile word, and numbers were paper-thin comfort when timbers bent under the strain of mountains. Most of the miners didn't complain. They couldn't. Complaints meant no wages, and no wages meant hungry families. So they kept digging, even as the ground betrayed them. Granite Hollow itself bore the scars of that betrayal. There had been cave-ins before, smaller ones that claimed 1 or 2 men at a time. Funerals were quick, plain, and too frequent. Black dresses and veils became as common as Sunday coats. The cemetery on the hill filled faster than the schoolhouse down the road. Yet still, every dawn, men lined up at the shaft, lanterns in hand. What else could they do? That winter had been particularly cruel. Snow fell heavy, pressing down on roofs and sealing windows shut with ice. Supplies from neighboring towns arrived late, slowed by storms. Hunger gnawed at Granite Hollow like a rat at the walls. The miners pushed harder, deeper, desperate to bring out where that could be sold for flour, coal, and whiskey. The company pushed harder too, cutting corners to meet quotas, ignoring the warnings of creaking beams and dripping ceilings. The wives of Granite Hollow noticed. They always did. It was in the way their husbands came home with hollow eyes, coughing harder than before, moving slower as if the mine had stolen a piece of them each day. It was in the way men muttered over whiskey at the saloon, speaking in low voices of tunnels that seemed ready to fold in on themselves. But whispers never left the wooden walls. Fear in a mining town was like smoke. You breathed it in, but you never pointed to where it came from. The children noticed too. They drew pictures in the snow of black tunnels and stick-figure men trapped inside. They played games, daring each other to run close to the shaft's mouth, as if mocking the beast that swallowed their fathers each morning. But even their laughter carried an edge, the kind of sound that broke too easily into silence. Granite Hollow lived on fragile ground, and everyone knew it. The mine gave life, and the mine threatened to take it back. Yet routine dulled fear. Dawn came, men descended, or was hauled, and night returned. Over and over, the cycle held, until that January day when the earth made its final decision. And the ground beneath Granite Hollow would prove just how fragile it truly was. It began with a sound so small, so easy to dismiss, that no one gave it weight. A faint crack, like a branch snapping in a distant forest. In the tunnels below, the men barely noticed. Picks struck stone. Hammers rang. The noise of labor was louder than any whisper of danger. But the earth has a way of warning before it breaks, and those warnings had already begun. Dust drifted from the ceiling in lazy swirls. At first, the men thought little of it, just the usual tremors of a living mine. One miner, a boy no older than 18, lifted his lamp and frowned at the fine mist falling through the air. He rubbed grit from his eyes and forced a grin, not wanting to be the one to show fear. Fear was contagious underground, and once it spread, it could cripple every hand and heart in the shaft. But then came the groan. Low, long, the kind of sound that seemed to come from the bones of the mountain itself. Lanterns swung slightly on their hooks. Men paused mid-swing, eyes darting at one another in the wavering light. The silence that followed was worse than the groan. It was a silence full of questions no one dared ask out loud. "Keep working," someone muttered. And so they did. Above ground, the wives at the gate had their own sense of unease. They were used to waiting, their hours stretched thin with gossip and small chores done in the cold. But this morning, something different hovered in the air. The snow seemed heavier, the wind sharper. Dogs barked without cause. One woman, clutching her shawl tighter, muttered that the air itself felt wrong, as if the mountain was holding its breath. Back below, the miners pressed deeper into the tunnels. Some joked, louder than usual, as though trying to bury their nerves beneath laughter. Others worked faster, eager to finish their section and retreat closer to the shaft. But the signs kept coming. A timber beam snapped, not fully, just a splinter that rang sharp in the air. Men froze, staring at the beam as if their collective gaze might hold it in place. Someone wedged a wedge of scrap wood beneath it and nodded grimly. "Good as new," he lied. Minutes stretched. Then another sound rolled through the rock, heavier this time, like a muffled thunderclap far beneath their boots. Dust rained harder. The men coughed, wiping their faces with blackened sleeves. One lantern sputtered, nearly extinguished, before flaring back to life. The youngest among them whispered a prayer too soft for others to hear. The warnings were undeniable now. Yet in a mind, denial was survival. To acknowledge danger was to admit helplessness. They had no escape but the shaft, and it was too far, too narrow, too fragile to trust and panic. So they swung their picks harder, as if noise and motion might hold the mountain still. Above, the wives noticed the ground trembling beneath their boots. Just a quiver, a ripple in the frozen dirt. They exchanged glances but said nothing. Speaking fear aloud was like tempting fate. One mother pulled her child close, tucking a scarf tighter around his neck, her eyes fixed on the mouth of the shaft. Then it came, the unmistakable shudder. The earth shifted as though shrugging off a great weight. Below, the tunnels roared with a sound no man could mistake. The voice of stone collapsing on itself. The lamps shook violently. Beams cracked like gunfire. The air filled with choking clouds of dust. And the men realized too late that the first signs had been warnings. Warnings ignored. It started with a single snap, a timber beam breaking clean in two. The sound shot through the tunnels like a rifle crack, bouncing off the stone walls. Every man froze. Silence fell heavier than the dust swirling in the air. Then came a second snap, and the third. In seconds, the mine was alive with the groans of breaking wood and the terrible grinding of stone shifting where it should not move. The mountain gave way. The collapse thundered through the shaft with a force that shook the ground above. Walls split open. Ceilings rained rock. Lanterns shattered as men scrambled, their shouts lost in the roar. Some tried to run for the shaft. Others threw themselves beneath beams, praying the timbers might hold. But the earth was merciless. It came down in waves, crushing, smothering, swallowing whole chambers in an instant. Above ground, the wives heard it before they saw anything. The sound tore through the frozen air, a muffled explosion that rattled windows and sent birds scattering from the trees. For a moment, the entire town seemed to tremble. Children screamed. Horses reared in panic. And then came the silence, the kind of silence that follows disaster, when even the wind dares not move. At the shaft's mouth, dust billowed upward like smoke from a cannon. The women surged forward, skirts tangling in the snow, hands clutching the gate as though they could rip it open by force. Their cries pierced the stillness, calling names that would never again be answered. The men at the surface, supervisors, engineers, laborers off shift, stood frozen in horror, staring at the plume of dust rising like a death shroud from the earth. Below, chaos reigned. The tunnels became a storm of falling stone and choking blackness. Men shouted for lanterns that had been extinguished. They called for one another, voices sharp with terror, then were cut off mid-cry as walls folded in. Some were buried in an instant, entombed without even the chance to scream. Others clawed at the dirt with bare hands, desperate to find a pocket of air, lungs burning as the dust thickened. A handful tried to reach the cage, stumbling through collapsing corridors, but the path was blocked. A rain of debris sealed the way. The single escape, the fragile wooden lifeline to the surface, was gone. They were trapped. The collapse rolled on like thunder, echoing through the tunnels until it seemed endless. Every crash was another chamber folding in, another passage sealed, another life extinguished. When the last rumble finally faded, the silence underground was suffocating. The mountain had spoken, and 47 men were caught in its answer. On the surface, the townspeople gathered quickly, drawn by the sound. They crowded near the shaft, faces pale against the snow, breath steaming in the cold. Mothers held children close. Wives clutched one another, voices trembling with prayers and curses. The foreman shouted orders, his voice cracking as he demanded ropes, shovels, men to dig. But all knew in their hearts what the thunder had meant. Granite Hollow had always lived in fear of this moment. The mine had taken men before, one at a time, two at a time, but never like this. Never so many, all at once, all swallowed in the same terrible instant. The ground beneath their homes, their lives, their very survival had betrayed them. As the dust settled into the sky, the town seemed to hold its breath. 47 men had entered the earth that morning, and now 47 names hung in the silence, waiting to be carved into stone. The gate was little more than a wooden fence, built to keep children and stray livestock from wandering into the shaft. But that morning, it became the barrier between life and loss. The wives pressed against it, hands gripping the frozen wood so tightly their knuckles turned white. They stared into the mouth of the mine, into the swirling dust rising like smoke from a battlefield. Every instinct told them to run inside, to pull their husbands out with their own hands. Yet all they could do was wait. The sound of the collapse still echoed in their ears. Some covered their mouths to stifle sobs, while others cried openly, calling names into the void as if voices alone could pierce stone. One woman, Mary Laskin, screamed her husband's name until her throat cracked. Another, Emma Clark, sank to her knees in the snow, clutching her baby to her chest as if holding onto the only piece of her family she had left above ground. Children clung to skirts, eyes wide, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, but old enough to sense the terror that gripped their mothers. The older boys stared silently at the shaft, their jaws clenched, trying to be men though they were still years away. Some of them would soon be forced into those same tunnels to replace the fathers they were losing. The men who remained above ground tried to form a plan. They spoke of rescue, of clearing rubble, of lowering ropes into the shaft. But the wives saw the truth in their faces. These men knew the mountain's cruelty. They had seen what stone could do to flesh. They knew that, in most cases, rescue was just another word for recovery. Still, no one dared say it aloud. The hours dragged. Snow fell again, thin flakes drifting down to settle on shawls, on hair, on the shoulders of women who refused to move from the gate. Their lips whispered prayers. Rosaries passed between trembling fingers. The church bell rang noon, then 1, then 2. No man returned. Some of the wives clung to hope fiercely, their eyes fixed on the shaft, as though expecting their husbands to emerge covered in dust, coughing but alive. Others broke under the weight of silence. They slumped against the fence, eyes blank, rocking back and forth as if motion could keep despair at bay. A few turned their anger outward, shouting at the foreman, accusing the company of ignoring warnings, of pushing the men too deep, too fast. Their voices cracked with fury, but beneath it lay only grief. Night fell early in Montana winters, and by the time the sun dipped below the hills, lanterns were lit around the gate. The golden glow illuminated pale faces streaked with tears, breath rising in clouds that vanished into the cold. Still they waited. The mine was no longer just a place of work. It was a tomb, and they would not leave it, not until someone gave them an answer. Inside the homes of Granite Hollow, supper pots went cold on stoves. Beds remained empty. Fires burned low. The entire town seemed to press itself against that single wooden gate, bound together by dread and silence. As midnight neared, the mine remained silent. No cries, no signals, just the endless stillness of earth holding its secrets tight. The wives stayed at their vigil, watching, listening, praying, knowing deep down what none of them wanted to admit. Their men were not coming home. At dawn the next morning, the town gathered at the shaft. Lanterns swayed in the frigid air, their flames dim against the pale light of a winter sun. The night had brought no miracles. The shaft remained silent, a dark wound in the earth that refused to give back what it had taken. Now, the question hovered over Granite Hollow like smoke. Were they digging for survivors, or were they only retrieving the dead? The foreman barked orders, trying to steady the crowd with the sound of authority. Crews of men, those not on shift during the collapse, were called forward. They carried picks, shovels, and timber beams, their faces grim, eyes hollow. Each knew what awaited below. Still they went. Duty and desperation drove them, and for some, guilt. They had escaped by chance, spared by the timing of a shift change or sick day. That guilt demanded they risk everything to bring the others back. The rescue began slowly. The shaft itself was unstable, the collapse having twisted supports and buried ladders. Every step downward was treacherous. Men descended with ropes tied to their waists, their bodies trembling as they vanished into the same darkness that had devoured their friends. Above, wives and children clung to the ropes, watching them snake into the abyss, whispering prayers that they would come back. Hours passed, and the rescue became a ritual of silence and waiting. The first reports returned grim. Entire tunnels had folded in on themselves, packed with stone and splintered beams. Lanterns were useless in the dust-choked dark. The air was foul, heavy with gas. It was nearly impossible to breathe for long, let alone dig. And yet the men kept at it, clawing through rubble with bleeding hands, listening for any sound of life. But no voices answered. No tapping from trapped survivors. No cries for help. Only silence. On the surface, the wives demanded news, swarming each man who climbed back up the ropes. Their questions were sharp, desperate, each one hoping for the smallest scrap of hope. Had they heard anything? Had they seen anyone? Was it possible, just possible, that their husbands were still alive in some hidden pocket of air? The rescuers offered little, only weary shakes of the head, eyes that refused to meet theirs. Still, the work continued. Hope, however fragile, was enough to keep shovels moving. No one dared to say the word recovery. Not yet. To admit that would mean surrendering to grief before the earth even released the bodies. By nightfall, exhaustion had set in. The men above ground took shifts hauling rubble, feeding the workers, tending fires that burned against the bitter cold. Wives stood shoulder to shoulder at the gate, their faces ghostly in the lantern light. Some refused food, refused warmth, as if stepping away would betray the men still trapped below. They held vigil, whispering names over and over, clinging to the hope that the mountain might still return one of them alive. But the truth was already seeping into their bones. The deeper the rescue crews dug, the worse the damage became. Tunnels collapsed in layers, chamber after chamber sealed shut by tons of stone. The timbers meant to hold the earth had snapped like twigs. Entire passageways were unrecognizable, twisted into piles of ruin. By the second night, the foreman stopped using the word rescue. His orders shifted. More ropes, more shovels, more men, yes. But the tone had changed. They were digging to recover, not to save. The wives heard it in his voice. Their faces hardened, hope thinning like the last coals of a dying fire. Some broke into sobs, finally allowing grief to spill into the cold night air. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to accept the weight of what was becoming undeniable. Rescue had ended. Recovery had begun. When grief settles over a town, silence usually follows. But in Granite Hollow, the silence didn't last long. By the third day, as bodies began to be pulled from the earth, limbs broken, faces blackened, lungs filled with dust, another sound rose to the surface. Whispers. Bitter, sharp, dangerous whispers. The wives began first, standing by the shaft with shawls wrapped tight around their shoulders. They muttered to one another about the company's haste, about how the men had complained for weeks that the beams groaned and the ceilings dripped. They remembered overheard fragments from kitchen tables. They're cutting corners again. We're working deeper than the supports can hold. These scraps now twisted together into something poisonous. Negligence. Greed. The miners still alive above ground carried heavier knowledge. They had seen the signs with their own eyes. Cracked timbers left unreplaced, warning sounds ignored, orders to push deeper despite the risks. There's money in that vein, the overseer had said, waving away fears with a flick of his hand. The company wanted production. The men were forced to obey, and now 47 lay dead for it. At first, no one spoke aloud in the presence of the foreman or his superiors. But anger grows the way fire does, quiet at first, then hungry, then impossible to contain. Soon, the whispers reached the saloon. Over whiskey glasses and clenched fists, the men began to speak of the company's greed openly. They told of shifts pushed too long, of warnings silenced by threats of dismissal. And each time another body was dragged up from the shaft, each time another wife collapsed in sobs at the sight of her husband's ruined form, the fire spread. The company men tried to smother it. They posted statements on wooden boards at the gate. The collapse was unavoidable, a natural act, an unfortunate tragedy. They spoke in careful tones of sympathy, of promises to care for widows and children. But no words could erase what the town already knew. This was no act of nature. It was a man-made disaster, born of greed and negligence. Worse still, rumors grew that the company had been warned. An inspector, some said, had filed concerns months earlier. A letter had been sent. Meetings had been held. And still, nothing changed. Every man in Granite Hollow had risked his life each time he stepped below the earth. But now it was clear. Those risks weren't fate. They were forced. The tension thickened. Wives who once prayed together now clenched their fists together, demanding answers. The preacher's sermons shifted from comfort to condemnation, his voice rising with righteous anger against those who placed gold above God. And the miners who remained, men broken but alive, looked at the shaft not as a place of work anymore, but as a graveyard carved by corporate hands. At night, the whispers became shouts. In homes lit by dim lanterns, voices grew louder. They knew. They sent them to their deaths. Blood is on their hands. The town of Granite Hollow had been built on fragile ground, but now it teetered on something more dangerous than the earth itself. It teetered on fury. As the bodies piled, so too did the anger. Negligence and greed, these were no longer whispers. They were truths etched into every coffin nailed shut on that frozen January ground. After the last body had been lifted from the shaft, the mountain fell silent. The chaos of the collapse, the clamor of shovels, the cries of the wives, all of it faded into a cold, empty stillness. Granite Hollow itself seemed to pause, as if the hills around it were holding their breath, waiting for something that would never come. But silence has weight, and grief has memory. The tunnels below were no longer just passages of stone. They were graves lined with the echoes of 47 men. Lanterns no longer swung from hooks, but the dust and debris carried the memory of their light. Every step into the mine now felt like walking into a tomb. The surviving miners avoided it when they could. They whispered that the place was cursed, that the earth remembered, that it had claimed more than bodies. It had claimed peace. Even above ground, the quiet was oppressive. Granite Hollow streets were empty at dusk. Doors remained shut, fireplaces dim. Children spoke in hushed tones of shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should, and dogs refused to enter the hills. Wives sat in their homes, staring at the gate, staring at the mountain, waiting for men who would never return. Nights were the worst. The wind howled through the hills like voices calling from below, and some swore they heard the faint sound of picks striking stone in the distance. But when anyone went to investigate, there was nothing, only snow and silence. The haunted quiet seeped into the town's very foundations. The saloon remained open only for a few hours each day, and even there, the laughter was brittle, hollow. Conversations turned quickly to hushed tones. Every miner, every mother, every child carried a piece of the disaster inside them. The collapse had left more than a void in the mountain. It had carved emptiness into every heart in Granite Hollow. Some nights, the foreman would stand at the gate, alone, looking down into the shaft. He swore he could hear the men calling to him, begging for help, begging for forgiveness. The company had paid its debts in coal and wages, but nothing could undo the weight of 47 lives buried beneath Montana's hills. Travelers and neighboring townspeople spoke of Granite Hollow with caution. A town that whispers to the dead, they said. A place where the mountain remembers. And in a sense, the mountain did. Miners who returned to work spoke of shivering in hallways that were not cold, of shadows moving just beyond the light, of the faint scent of sweat and earth that clung to the tunnels even after the dead had been removed. Families were never the same. Mothers rocked their children in silence. Fathers drank in the shadows of their homes, haunted by the memory of friends who vanished in the darkness. And still, the mountain waited. It had taken its due, and the earth's memory was long. Granite Hollow survived, but it was no longer the same. 47 names were etched into memory, each one a reminder of the mountain's power and the fragility of life above it. Silence hung over the hills like a shroud, and anyone who lived there understood that beneath the frozen ground, the earth kept its secrets forever. Some nights, travelers swear they see lanterns swinging in the mountain, long after the collapse. 47 lights, faint but unyielding, moving through tunnels that no one dares enter. The town of Granite Hollow sleeps uneasily beneath Montana's hills, forever listening to the haunted silence below. Even more than a century later, Granite Hollow remembers. The town rebuilt, the mines reopened, but the memory of January 24th, 1887, never faded. 47 men disappeared into the mountain, and in a way, they never left. Their presence lingers in the rhythm of the town, in the cautious steps of children near the old mine, in the quiet glances of miners who know the mountain's appetite hasn't changed. Visitors speak of it in hushed tones. Lanterns swinging where no one walks, the faint echo of picks in tunnels long sealed, whispers carried on the wind when the hills should be silent. Some swear they feel hands brush theirs in empty hallways, or a sudden chill that makes the hair on their arms rise. Locals call it the mountain's memory, or the curse of the shaft, or simply the shadow of 47 lives taken too soon. Families who still carry the bloodline of those lost say the men's spirits are protective, lingering near the gates and hills, warning of danger. Others tell darker stories, of nightmares, of strange sounds in the night, of waking to footprints in the snow that vanish before the sun rises. It is as though the mountain itself refuses to let go, as though each miner's life, abruptly stolen, carved a scar too deep to heal. The old cemetery on the hill bears their names. Simple stones, blackened by decades of snow and wind, mark where the dead rest above ground. But the true graves are still underground. The earth swallowed them whole, and it keeps them. Granite Hollow's children grow up hearing the story as a cautionary tale, a lesson of respect for the mountain, and of the greed and carelessness that can turn work into tragedy. Miners who continue to work in the region speak of shadows that flit across the tunnels when no one is there. Tools move of their own accord, and sometimes lanterns swing with no breeze. Those who have experienced it speak sparingly. They are men of earth and stone, of silence and endurance. They do not scoff at stories, for they know too well the power of the mountain and the echoes of the lives it claimed. Even now, historians and writers come to Granite Hollow, drawn by the story of 47 men who entered the shaft and never returned. They walk the hills, speak to descendants, and feel the weight of the event pressing through the snow, the wind, the hills. Some leave shaken, some awed, all changed by the stark reminder of how fragile human life is against the relentless persistence of nature and the greed of those who wield it carelessly. In the long shadows of the Montana hills, the past and present mingle. 47 shadows still linger, etched into the consciousness of Granite Hollow. Their lanterns sway in memory. Their voices echo in the wind. And the town, built on fragile ground, remembers. It never forgets. The mountain waits. The mine waits. And beneath it all, the 47 men who vanished that January day live on in the silence, in the shadows, in the very heartbeat of the town. 47 lives, lost to ambition and negligence, but remembered forever.